My name is Grace, and I'm 32 years old. 3 years ago, I divorced my ex-husband due to his infidelity, but recently, I found happiness again in my new marriage. My current husband brings so much joy into my life that it's hard to imagine those dark days, though sometimes, the painful memories do resurface. My ex-husband was emotionally abusive and treated me like a housemaid. Despite working full-time, I was expected to handle all the household chores. If a single piece of trash was left on the floor, he'd yell at me. He insisted on having at least 5 dishes for dinner, and if I served less, he'd refuse to eat. I'll never forget the time he got angry because I served him prepped meals. Yet later he snacked on potato chips, leaving me to clean up the crumbs. Even when I protested, he'd sneer, "What's the point of having a wife who doesn't do housework?" His constant belittling gradually wore down my self-esteem. Before we were married, he wasn't like this at all. Just when I had reached my breaking point, he demanded a divorce. He had a mistress. He wouldn't tell me who she was, and by then, I was too exhausted to care. "Fine, but I'm taking alimony," I told him. After securing the amount I wanted, I closed the chapter on our brief, 2-year marriage. As I was packing up to move, I found myself thinking about Nancy, my best friend from high school. She was there for me after the divorce, always offering a listening ear and encouragement. I hadn't even had a chance to tell her about my remarriage, as I'd been so busy with the move and all the paperwork. Only my close family knew about it. I owed it to Nancy to properly share the news. I decided to focus on these happier thoughts, rather than the painful ones. With a lighter heart, I started humming a tune and resumed packing. 2 months after the move, I was enjoying afternoon tea while flipping through a magazine. Now that I was settled into my new job and had gotten used to the area, I began seriously considering meeting up with Nancy. Just searching for recommended restaurants and cafes was exciting. First, I needed to get in touch and check our schedules. It had been a while since we last saw each other, and I found myself feeling a bit nervous. Just as I was about to grab my phone to text Nancy, the doorbell rang. Since I didn't know anyone in the area yet, I assumed it was a solicitor, but when I opened the door, I was surprised to see a police officer standing there. I wondered if there had been some sort of incident. "We've received multiple reports of you stalking a certain man. Do you have any idea about this?" The officer's words left me speechless. Apparently, the man had been receiving letters almost daily, filled with "I love you" messages and other romantic advances. I had just moved to this neighborhood, so I suggested it might be a case of mistaken identity, but the officer informed me that the complainant had specifically named me. I asked who the complainant was, but the officer could only apologize and explain that he couldn't reveal that information yet. "I'm sorry, we've received several complaints, and I just came to confirm, though I can't disclose the complainant's name yet," he said. Though bewildered, I understood that the officer was just doing his job. I reminded myself that I had done nothing wrong and needed to stand my ground. The officer seemed to understand that I had only recently moved in and assured me, "We will come again to report if we find out anything." Before leaving, after that unsettling encounter, I threw myself onto my bed, kicking my legs in frustration and burying my face into the pillow with a groan. The fact that someone had actually named me in a police complaint was unnerving, leaving me with an uncomfortable, creeping feeling that I couldn't shake. As I tried to make sense of how and why this had happened, I noticed the sun was already beginning to set. I had planned to call Nancy, but now I was in no mood for it. With a heavy sigh, I forced myself up to take in the laundry, trying to push the troubling thoughts out of my mind. My thoughts drifted back to the day before. After the police left, I had discussed the incident with my husband when he got home, and he had reassured me that it must have been some sort of misunderstanding. His words had lifted my spirits, helping me regain a bit of energy, but once he left for work and I was alone again, the melancholy returned, settling over me like a dark cloud. Just then, my phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. I could have ignored it, but something told me I shouldn't. With a sense of unease, I answered the call. "Grace, it's been a while," said a voice I hadn't expected to hear, and I felt my breath catch. It was my ex-husband, Ray. He seemed to relish my silence, letting out a low chuckle. "I heard you still haven't admitted to stalking me. I'm disgusted with the police for not investigating thoroughly," he sneered. In that moment, it all clicked. The bizarre complaint the day before had come from him. "So you're the one who made that baseless complaint to the police?" I asked, my voice tight with anger. "Of course," he replied, his tone dripping with misplaced confidence. You moved close to me because you still have feelings for me, right? Everyone around me is shocked by it too. Ray had always been annoyingly sure of himself, and now that trait was infuriating me even more. I could almost see the smug smile on his face as he spoke. Apparently, he had been spreading the rumor that I was stalking him. The idea was absurd, but the painful memories of our past came flooding back, and I could feel my temper rising despite my efforts to stay calm. It's been 3 years. Ray, what are you talking about? Besides, I'm remarried, I said firmly, but he just laughed, dismissing my words as if they were of no consequence. If the police can't resolve this, then we'll have to handle it ourselves, he said, suggesting we meet in person. He proposed a diner as the location. Fine, I thought, I have nothing to hide. Despite my anger, I agreed to the meeting, though looking back, I realize it was a reckless decision. When I arrived at the diner, Ray was waiting at the entrance. He looked different from the man I used to know, now dressed in a high-quality suit that exuded wealth. Grace, have you gotten prettier somehow? He remarked, his voice dripping with insincerity as the scent of his cologne filled the air. Don't even start, I replied sharply. Frowning, Ray merely shrugged, unbothered by my cold reception. Same old Grace, still lacking in charm, he said, his words a taunt I chose to ignore. I followed him into the diner, where he had already reserved a table. To my shock, I saw someone I didn't expect sitting there. Nancy, what are you doing here? I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. My best friend, Nancy, was sitting there, exchanging knowing glances with Ray, both of them smirking. Nancy and I got remarried. Don't be jealous just because we're happy, Ray said, casually draping an arm around her shoulder. The sight of his expensive, flashy watch glinting in the light felt almost surreal. Oh, this? I'm a CEO now, you know, thanks to Nancy. Of course, he boasted, after our divorce. It seemed Ray had started a company with the help of Nancy's parents, and business had been good, very good. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. What stunned me wasn't the flashy suit or the smug demeanor, it was the word remarriage. Nancy, who knew every detail of how horribly I had been treated by this man, had chosen to marry him. Noticing my confusion, Nancy smiled brightly and said, when you invited me to your wedding, I was shocked. Ray, with someone like you? Honestly, I never liked you from the start. You were always the center of attention, so I decided to pretend to be your best friend and bring you down one day. She said this without a trace of remorse, her smile unnervingly cheerful. Every time I met Ray, we used to joke that we met in the wrong order, she added, snuggling up to him happily. Watching her, a wave of nausea washed over me. This was the same woman who had comforted me after my divorce, who had listened to all my grievances with what I now realized must have been a vile, twisted satisfaction. Nancy continued, gleefully recounting how she fell in love with Ray at my wedding. She admitted that she had secretly slipped him her contact information that day and started pursuing him immediately. According to her, Ray quickly became infatuated with her. The most shocking revelation, however, was that Nancy had encouraged Ray to emotionally abuse me. No wonder his personality had changed so drastically after we got married. They had been plotting against me the entire time, relishing in my misery while I remained clueless. When you wouldn't give up, we decided to make Ray pay you off and push for the divorce, Nancy said, casually sipping her orange juice. As if the whole situation was nothing more than an amusing story, she revealed that the alimony Ray had given me was actually funded by her, a fact I was learning for the first time. Anyway, could you stop stalking Ray? We were shocked when we saw you the other day, but to think you moved here just to stalk him. It's been 3 years since the divorce. Grace, it's really creepy. We're happily married now, enjoying our life, unlike you, so just give up already, will you? From the way she spoke, it was clear that Nancy had seen me around the neighborhood and had convinced herself that I had moved here to stalk Ray, but that was the least of my concerns right now. I stood up, trying to keep my anger in check, looking directly at both of them. I stated firmly, I am not stalking anyone, and I certainly have no interest in a man like you. Without another word, I turned and walked out, ignoring Nancy's mocking laughter that echoed behind me. Almost 2 months have passed since that encounter. I received a call from Ray. And, expecting it, I answered. On the other end of the line, Ray sounded panicked, and I couldn't help but smirk, knowing exactly what had happened. It turns out you were the one being stalked, but not by me, it was your current mistress, I informed him. Apparently, after marrying Nancy, Ray had started another affair, and this new mistress had become obsessed with him, turning into a stalker. That's the truth, Ray. His voice wavered as he stammered out an explanation. It became clear that he knew the stalker was his mistress but had tried to frame me to cover his tracks. He feared that if Nancy found out, she'd leave him, and he'd lose the financial support from her parents. Nancy had overheard that I had moved into the area, so they concocted the plan to accuse me of stalking to throw her off the scent. Lies built upon lies, all leading to this moment. It was just so typical of Ray. I'm sorry I framed you as a stalker, but you didn't have to go this far. Ray's voice trembled with desperation. From the other end of the line, I could hear the frantic pounding on a door and Nancy's furious shouting. It sounded like he'd barricaded himself in a room. Pathetic. I only told Nancy the truth, out of respect for our old friendship, I replied calmly. Ray's distress was likely about the photo I sent Nancy. I'd attached a note that read, "Expect a claim for damages for the affair." The photo clearly showed his mistress stalking him and, in another frame, Ray walking arm in arm with her into a hotel. I'm honestly shocked you take her to a hotel while she was still harassing you, I said, feigning disbelief. I had no choice. She threatened to tell Nancy and push for a divorce if I didn't meet her. Ray tried to justify his actions. As for how I got the photo, I owed it all to my current husband. He runs a private detective agency and recently opened his own office, which is why we moved to this area. However, I couldn't help but feel a bit guilty that the first job after his office opened involved my ex-husband. My husband tracked down the real stalker in about a month and gathered solid evidence of Ray's affair with her. I couldn't thank him enough. Oh, and expect a claim for damages from both you and Nancy, I added. Ray made a confused noise. You knew who the real stalker was, yet you still reported me to the police and spread those rumors. How low can you sink? I could tell Ray was at a loss for words, but I pressed on. I was almost ready to forget our marriage, but you've reopened old wounds. You're going to pay for that. Right after I heard Ray's pitiful whimper, there was a loud crash and an angry shout from Nancy. It seemed she'd broken down the door and stormed into the room. I heard her demand, "Who are you sneaking around talking to?" Then the phone switched hands. Nancy must have grabbed it from Ray. Who is this? That stalker chick? No, it's Grace, I replied evenly. Nancy didn't calm down. Even when she realized it was me, she continued to rant, furious about the prospect of paying compensation for the affair. Are you kidding me? Why should I have to pay compensation now? I explained what I'd learned from the lawyer my husband introduced me to. If a divorce occurs due to an affair, and you didn't know who the other party was, you can demand compensation up to 3 years after finding out. I've also informed your husband that I'll be seeking damages for defamation. Nancy's voice cracked with tears. You money grubber, don't take away my happiness. You're just getting back what you dished out, I replied coldly. Nancy had Ray do her dirty work just because she disliked me, tormenting me all the while pretending to be my friend. Even after the divorce, she played the part of the supportive friend while laughing at me behind my back. I couldn't forgive her. I'm not paying any compensation, Nancy shouted. I wouldn't be so sure about that, I replied calmly. When you called me to that diner, I had a voice recorder in my bag. I didn't turn it on for self-defense, but it ended up capturing your confession, that you were the one Ray had the affair with 3 years ago when we got divorced. And just so you know, I'm recording this call as well. There was a pause, but I continued before Nancy could respond. It doesn't matter what you say now, you're going to be held accountable. If necessary, I'll use this recording as evidence to make sure both you and Ray pay for what you've done. There's a business card from a lawyer in the photos I sent you, right? From now on, please direct any communication through that lawyer. Without waiting for her rebuttal, I hung up the phone. As the call ended, I felt a sense of closure, finally putting the divorce from 3 years ago behind me. Thanks to the lawyer my husband introduced me to, I managed to get Ray and Nancy to pay most of the compensation I demanded. When Nancy's parents found out about the compensation, they disowned her, and the stalker publicly exposed Ray's affair at his workplace. Ray lost his social credibility and the support of Nancy's parents. Even now, it seems he and Nancy are still dealing with the fallout from their affair. We just moved, and you've already been through so much, my husband said sympathetically. Despite all the trouble, he remained kind and supportive, smiling at me through it all. I want to cherish this man and the peaceful life we can finally enjoy together.